quite a treat today because between Bob and Rick, they have over 80 years of Dominican experience to share with you. Without any further, Rick is going to speak first, Bob is going to speak second. They really don't need any introduction. Rick Calabrese.
Great. We're going to have a brief interruption because I did ask for a wireless mic. But until it comes, I'm starting. Welcome. Come on in. Geraldine was my student back in 73.
70, yes, 71.
71. Okay. My name is Rick Calabrese, and the good news for me is that this is not really my last lecture. Thank you. I hope that I never have to give a last lecture, but I know eventually that will come. Ismael, welcome. So I'm going to be talking today about what our first name, welcome Jean, please come in. Jean Cooper, Sister Jean Murray.
Here are some places.
So I'm going to be sharing with you some things I might say if it really were my last lecture. And I want to make it clear that what you're hearing are the subjective truths of a man who is now in his 70s, who was reared in an Italian Catholic family, most of whom were poor immigrants with little education. Today I would describe myself as well-educated, privileged, white, and the recipient of 48 years of the Caritas, for which this institution is known. And that gives me a particular welcome. More Dominican sisters, that's great. And that gives me a particular worldview. Hi. Raise your hands if there's an empty seat next to you. So I have a worldview and it's subjective. But each of you has a worldview as well. And your worldview, welcome. Raise your hands again if we have any empty seats. And your worldview is also valid. I could learn from you, and I think you could learn from me. But I want to make it clear that all over the world this morning, there are people waking up who are hungry, who see their children dying for lack of food, health care, indoor plumbing, sanitation. People who are waking up in countries where there is discrimination because of gender, because of race, because of their ethnicity. These people too have truths from which we could all learn. And that is, if, like me, you've spent your life trying to put the pieces together. I remember starting this very young, thinking of the meaning of life as some kind of a puzzle, and if I could just get all the pieces together, it would all make sense. Well, I'm not there, but I do know something today, and that's what I want to begin with. Welcome. I want to begin by assuring you that I have a subjective truth from which you could all learn. And the person next to you has a subjective truth from which you could learn. And those people who are waking up hungry and are discriminated against, if they were giving a last lecture, we would have something to learn from them too. So I'm kind of finishing the preamble. You really haven't heard the first truth yet. Okay. So you got the preamble. In 1993, I was 50 years old, and Dominican at that time had a series of last lectures. And I was invited at that time, along with some other faculty, to give a last lecture at 50. And I did. And when I was asked to talk today, I thought perhaps I would just tweak that up a little bit and give that one again. I went and I looked it over. And every one of those truths is still valid, and if you're interested, it's here. I still subscribe to those. But the last 22 years have really been very significant for me. And so what I'm talking about today are additional truths that I've garnered over, Fredo, welcome, come on in, that I've garnered over the past 22 years. So I've already mentioned that I'm a man in my 70s. And for the last 22 years, I've always traveled. I went to school, spent my junior year in Italy when I was 19 and traveled ever since. But the last 22 years have been spent, a lot of it has been spent in third world countries. I did have an opportunity through Dominican to teach in France. I taught in India. I taught in Poland. I did service work with Dominican in El Salvador and Cuba and Honduras and Africa and I don't know where else. And on my own, I've traveled around all the countries surrounding the Black Sea. I've traveled through China, Thailand, Vietnam, Hong Kong, Singapore. And so today's truths have to do with social justice and our obligations to our brothers and sisters around the planet. Truth number one, finally. 99.9% of we Homo sapiens share the same DNA. And that means that because of that 1.1%, we have different texture hair, we have different skin tones, we have different shaped noses, we come in all shapes and sizes. 99.9% of us are like practically identical twins. But why are we fighting? Why are there so many problems in the world? What's the reason? Well, I think the reason has to do with culture. And depending upon the macro reality you have from your family and your school and your city and your state and your hemisphere, and you have grown up with values, with a sense of what's right and what's wrong and what's good and what's bad. And you have a God, or maybe you have gods. And we infer that they're different from ours because they have names that are different from ours. And so we, because of culture, have different truths, different realities. Dominican has its own truth. A Dominican truth is that truth emerges through deliberation and collaboration. So this first truth, Emma, is that it is really in your best self-interest, if you have any concern about putting those pieces together, to try and understand those realities that are different from your own. Yours is valid, but it's only a part of the truth. If you want the whole truth, you need to be open to hearing what other people have to say. I have another truth I want to share with you. I don't want you in your later life to be thinking about what you could have done, what you should have done, what opportunity you passed up. I want you to learn early to articulate for yourself lofty but accomplishable goals. And then, that's the easy part. Articulating, visioning, even putting together a strategy. The hard part is to do it, to make it happen, to be tenacious, to experience yourself a winner, having accomplished. I have to confess something. I'm every man. I am ordinary. I am not a great intellect. But I do have discipline. And that has been a secret for me. I have two short, well, they're not so short, but I have a couple of anecdotes that I think make this point because they were epiphanies for me. I taught myself statistics at 30, and I actually became fit at 40. When I was 30 years old, I was a doctoral student at Northwestern. I had finished all of my coursework, and it was time to put a proposal together for a dissertation. When I entered Northwestern, there wasn't any requirement to take statistics. And while I was doing my coursework, they put in that requirement. And my advisor heartily urged me to take those classes. But I decided, oh, anthropology calls, social psychology calls. Those are much more interesting to me. And so I took those. And now, when I put together my study, which was a study of the getting acquainted process between Northwestern students and Rosary College students, it was an empirical study. And it did require a multivariate analysis of variance, whatever that is. And I went to my advisor and I said, well, they've accepted my proposal. Teach me how to do this. And he said, Rick, don't you remember I told you to take those classes? This is not my job, this is your job. And I'll never forget that feeling of, oh my God, I will never get this degree. I worked so hard for it. But my tuition gave me a free carrel in the library. I lived in Elmwood Park and I drove to Northwestern. This is during the summer. I was there by 9:30, 10 o'clock. I stayed until 3:30, 4 o'clock. And I checked out all these books. And I went through them sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, chapter by chapter, book by book, and by the end of the summer, I knew how to do a multivariate analysis of variance. But it taught me something. I probably could do anything if I just stuck to it. And that's what I want you to know. When I was 40 years old, I started recognizing that I was not as fit as I had been, and I thought I should do something about it. That was in the 80s. And running was popular, and I spent $60 on a pair of running shoes. And I put them on, and I ran out the door, and I went about a block and a half, and I made that easy. True story. And I took the shoes off, and I pushed them over to the side. Nobody picked them up. Nobody put them away, and every day I looked at them. And after about a week, I thought about the investment. I put the shoes back on, and I went out again. And I did a little better. And a couple of days later, I went out again. And now we're talking June or July, and there was something in our community newsletter about a turkey trot in November. You could either walk it or run it. And I checked the box, I'm running. And November came, and I had a goal. My goal was to finish in the middle of the pack. I lived next door to a couple of jocks. And I was going to run with them. And I did. I ran with them until about the middle of the race. And then I ran out of steam, but I accomplished the goal of finishing the race dead last. But I finished. I set a goal. Next year, I am finishing that race in the middle of the pack. And then, winter, summer, spring, and fall, until the following November, I went out every day. Rain, snow, I was out. By myself. I'm not social comparising myself to anybody. I'm just doing it. And then Thanksgiving came, and I'm running in the middle of the pack with my buddies. And we get to the midpoint of the race, and I said, hey guys, do you mind if I go on ahead? And I came in first. I got a race watch. I'm not a jock, guys. I'm not a jock. But I have discipline. So that's the truth here. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I want my students to see themselves at their best and to see that what they're capable, and that gets the ball rolling. I can do this. I can do this. Truth number 3. Life is tough. Life is tough. I don't want you to feel singled out when it happens to you, because it will. It happens to everybody. And when it happens, I want you to remember that the behavior you model during times of crisis is being noticed by other people. Sometimes it's your children, sometimes it's your spouse. And I want you to remember that you will get better. It will pass. You need to stick with hope because it will pass. 22 years ago, right about when I was giving that last lecture, I went through the most horrible part of my life, and I'm so happy she didn't come today. I might have cried. I mean, it was really difficult. I got divorced 22 years ago. And it was a very black time in my life. And a friend of mine, a professor in Boston, had already gone through a divorce, and he sent me a t-shirt. And he said somebody had sent it to him during his divorce. And I should read it every day before I put it on and run in it. And hi, welcome. And the shirt said, "Everything passes." And I put it on and I ran with that shirt on every day. And everything does pass. And by the way, I don't know if you've taken a good look at the people on either side of you, but they're probably smiling, particularly if you look them right in the eye. But you really have no idea what pain, what anxiety, and what issues everyone is dealing with. And so life is tough, and you will survive. Point number 3. Point number 4, back when I was a teaching assistant in the 1960s, one of my graduate professors said, mentoring me, "It isn't what you demand from your students that ultimately becomes the criterion on which you're going to be judged. Rather, it is what you tolerate from them. It is what you accept from them." And that brings me to a corollary. We are always intuiting one another. You can posture just so long. After a time, people will sense your essence. If you want to lead a life of integrity, of honesty, of transparency, of goodness, you need to wake up each day reminding yourself that that's who you are and that's what you do. It was Aristotle who left us this quote: "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is a habit rather than a single act. Truth number 5. If you wait until everything is optimal before you begin to enjoy your life, if you wait until all the pieces are together before you take the risk of living, you may find yourself too old and too infirm, because it never happens. It doesn't happen. Nothing ever gets perfect. I want you to realize that you have to make things happen now. So 22 years ago, my wife and I had traveled all over the world. We spent 3 months of our honeymoon in Europe. So 22 years ago, after that divorce, I didn't feel like traveling alone. I wanted to just stay home and dig in my garden, maybe read another book. But something pushed me to move on, to go. And I did, and you heard the places I've been over the past 22 years. So it wasn't optimal. If you're taking a cruise and you walk into the dining room, they say to you, do you want to sit alone or do you want to sit with people? And 3 times a day you have to make that decision. And I said, I'll sit with the people. And I made new friends. And I had new adventures. And I had new life experiences. And I continue to learn. And so what I'm saying to you is, accept your life and wherever you can, sprinkle a little glitter. Now this next truth I thought about not sharing. I tried sharing it with my grandson. I'm not sure he's getting it. I'm going to share it with you anyway. You have free will. I'm talking to the youngsters in here. You have free will, and you can give yourself permission, if you want, to seize the moment and to have instant gratification and momentary joy, and then maybe have significant negative consequences. This is the part my grandson didn't like. He's 19. He didn't like hearing that his frontal lobe is not fully developed yet. And it isn't until around the age of 23 or 24 that that lobe is developed. And until then, you've got to use the superego, Freudian terms here, or at least your ego, to keep yourself in check. So this 19-year-old grandson had heard the family stories about the fact that I kept a journal when I was 19 going to school in Italy, and he asked if he could read it. And I thought, before I give it to him, I better look it over one more. And I looked it over, and I found an interesting anecdote that I had remembered but hadn't really thought much about. When I was 19 with two of my roommates living in Rome, we decided to take a weekend off and rent a car and go to Florence for the weekend. None of us knew how to drive a stick shift. That's all they were renting in Rome back in '62. And so we decided to lie. So we went to the dealer, we said we knew how to drive a stick shift, we got the car, we made it as far as Florence. No, we made it as far as Siena. And then, laughingly, we proclaimed Fiat Morte. Pushed it off to the side of the road. We hitchhiked. We stayed the night in Siena, hitchhiked to Florence, had a wonderful time, took the train back, and life went on. Until one night, there's a knock on my door, and the proctor of the dormitory said, "Calabrese, did you rent a car?" Oh my God, we did. He says, "You are in big trouble." So this was 1962. I did have to go down to the American consulate. I did get scolded, but then I was sent back to school and nothing happened. I think today I may end up in jail. So, I mean, this is so not me. I'm rigid, I'm organized, I'm disciplined, I'm conscientious. But I did this. So if I could do this, you could do this. So my point here is to monitor that your actions, at least until the age of 24. Okay. And I'm on to my last truth. And it's a really significant one for me. And if you've taken any of my classes, you've heard me talk about this because I bring it up in every class that I teach. Anyone can be an alpha. Anyone can be an alpha human being. Being an alpha means being willing to risk looking forward, to risk being embarrassed as you actually reach out and offer help to someone you think needs assistance, rather than waiting for somebody else to do it, or rather not doing it because it's inconvenient. Being an alpha means knowing when it's appropriate to take the spotlight off yourself and to deflect it to somebody else who may be in more need of recognition. And finally, being an alpha means scanning the environment, consciously looking to see who needs some help, and then unobtrusively bringing yourself over there and doing it. 48 years with Sinsinawa Dominican sisters. Every one of them is this way. This is who they are. And this is what I have spent 48 years observing. I've had a couple of models, Sister Clemente, Sister Melissa, and so you're Dominicans, and this is what we do. Finally, in conclusion, my degree is in human communication studies. I teach intercultural communication, public speaking, interpersonal communication, and there's a tenet of communication I want to repeat. And that is that when you're giving a talk, you have to know when to quit before you get boring. You don't want to start repeating yourself. But I do want to leave you with one last thought. You don't know what you don't know. The persons next to you know things you don't know. People across the world know things you don't know. It is actually in your best self-interest to become the kind of person who's open to learning what you don't know. Dialogue, collaborate, put the pieces together if what you're interested in is a more objective truth. You're never going to have a total objective truth. Thank you all very much.
It's always a challenge to follow Professor Calabrese to the podium. And so, Rick, we're back there. I treasure your friendship and our many years in collaboration over the years. And thank you for your fine presentation. Even though I teach in the School of Business, I don't know statistics and I'm not fit, but unfortunately this isn't your last lecture, and these good folks will get to hear from you many times in the future. But it is, in a sense, my last lecture, as I will be totally retiring at the end of the year. So I have called it an exaugural commentary, sort of because it's, well, I thought that sounded more academic than a farewell address. Like that. And Dwight Eisenhower, in his farewell address upon leaving the presidency, warned of a military-industrial complex. Now, I'm not here to issue any warnings about that. My intent, after over 30 years teaching in the School of Business, and going on 50 years working in different fields, is merely to offer a commentary on Christianity in a world focused on profit maximization. And I do this by tying together excerpts from some of my academic writings with Dominican University's mission statement and two pieces of poetry, one of which comes from an unknown amateur poet in Mumbai, and one from a world-class, well-known poet. Now, part of the problem is, if I'm to do this in a half an hour, I have to stick to a script, so excuse me for that, but there's a lot of area I want to cover. Otherwise, as any students have had me, will tell you I tend to ramble on tangents, sort of like my tie. From time to time in class, I wear a specific tie that's tied into what I'm talking about. Now, today's tie is a limited edition Jerry Garcia. And he titled it Uncorrected Manuscript. I retitled it, as I want to do, Unfinished Manuscript. And as we get to the end, and I end with the ending of Tennyson's poem, Ulysses, hopefully it'll all come together and you'll understand what I'm talking about. So let's begin. C.S. Lewis concluded a paper read at the Oxford Socratic Club entitled Is Theology Poetry? By saying, quote, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Now, I paraphrased Lewis in my plain novel Eli Eli by comparing faith to a telescope, enabling us to put into focus what we're unable to see on our own. But we need to pick it up, bring it to our eyes, and look through it. The Dominican University's mission statement has been written through the lens of Christianity. Pope Francis and his predecessors have taken a look at our economic world and have not always liked what they saw, looking through the lens of Christianity. Now, among Jesus' last words on the cross were the words, "I thirst." I believe he was speaking not only of his physiological need, but also of a deeper metaphorical need, a thirst for a more just and humane world. And while Jesus did say, "The poor you will always have with you," he was not writing off the poor as a societal given that we should just get used to being in our presence. He was probably referencing, as he often did, the Old Testament and the book of Deuteronomy, where it is written, there will always be poor people, but then cautions us not to be hard-hearted or tight-fisted, but rather to be open-handed toward the poor and the needy. Pope Francis, in chapter 2 of his exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, warns we are experiencing a turning point in history. He marvels at the advances in so many fields, but is deeply concerned that at the same time, a majority, and I pause to emphasize, a majority of our contemporaries are barely living day to day. Rick referenced earlier. Today, he writes, everything comes under the laws of competition and the survival of the fittest, where the powerful feed upon the powerless. He warns our relationship to money has created new idols in a throwaway culture that is spreading, developing a globalization of indifference, and reducing us to one of our needs alone, consumption. Now, just yesterday, the Pope's selection to head the Archdiocese of Chicago, Bishop said, and I quote him, "When we allow consumerism and materialism to so invade our lives that we get to the point where we're indifferent to the poor, not only are the poor hurt, but our spirits are as well." In response to some of the Pope's comments on the economy, some commentators basically said, in a sense, be real, and questioned the awareness of the value of capitalism. It reminded me of an interview Phil Donahue did with Milton Friedman back in 1979, wherein Donahue raised some of the same points being raised by Pope Francis. And let's listen in for a moment. This lasts just a little over 2 minutes. Don't you love technology? Otherwise, I'm going to have to cover it.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power with it, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by free enterprise
But it
system.
seems to reward not virtue as much as ability to manipulate the system.
And what does reward virtue? You think the communist commissar rewards virtue? You think a Hitler rewards virtue? You think, excuse me, if you'll pardon me, do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of the virtue of the people appointed or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us.
Well,
I don't even trust you to do that.
Because we saw Friedman extols capitalism, praises greed, and humorously asked Donahue, where do you find these angels who organize society for the better? Well, let me tell you. That'll come. In that interview, Friedman said Donahue was taking a lot of things for granted. And I don't think anyone would argue with him about the productive activities that can be unleashed by capitalism. But questioning the excesses of capitalism does not suggest throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And talking about virtue in relation to capitalism is not an oxymoron. Friedman himself took a lot of things for granted, and his views on self-interest and greed need some perspective. In accepting the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1992, Gary Becker, a highly respected professor of economics and sociology from the University of Chicago, past any of us avoid profession, said, quote, "I have tried to pry economists away from narrow assumptions about self-interest. Behavior is driven by a much richer set of values and preferences." Another distinguished professor, Jeffrey Brennan, who writes at the intersection of economics, rationality, and political philosophy, uses the term cardboard economics to describe the claim that all social phenomena can be worked out in terms of working out the implications of individual self-interest. He cites a rarely quoted passage from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations that, quote, "A man ought to regard himself," this is from Adam Smith, "not as something separate and detached, but as a citizen of the world, a member of the vast commonwealth of nations, and to the interests of this great community. He ought at all times to be willing that his own little self-interest be sacrificed." Pope Francis has rightly pointed out that self-interest has grown belief. As he writes, "The thirst for power and possessions knows no limits." Now, there is no better example of this than the Wolf of Wall Street, who, as this slide of clips from the movie shows, epitomized the mantra that success equals excess, greed is good, and that nothing else, no one else, matters or should stand in the way of maximizing self-interest. I frequently tell students that if your goal in life is just to get more, you'll never achieve it. Because by definition, more can't be achieved. More is something beyond what we already have. Kenneth Goodpaster from the University of St. Thomas, by way of Harvard, Notre Dame, writes of spirituality as balancing the pursuit of purpose, and cautions us about the mesmerizing effects of goals. The fact that goals can distort our judgment at critical moments unless disciplined by clear values. He coined a term for this affliction, teleopathy, a form of goal sickness, an addiction to a single-minded, rationalized, detached, unbalanced pursuit of purpose. This is nothing new. The human species has always wanted more. As the next couple of slides show, We can see the desire for something beyond what we have or need reflected through the ages in art and political cartoons dating from Adam and Eve to our early history. This is from the late 1700s. And this last thing could be out of Dickens, or it could be from today. A recent article in The Atlantic entitled "The Rise of the New Global Elite" states, quote, "What is more relevant to our times, though, is that the rich of today are also different from the rich of yesterday. Our high-speed, globally connected economy has led to the rise of a new super elite that consists to a notable degree of first and second generation wealth. Its members are hardworking, highly educated, jet-setting meritocrats who feel that they are deserving winners of the tough worldwide economic competition. And many of whom, as a result, have an ambivalent attitude toward those of us who don't succeed in social capitalism. Perhaps most noteworthy, they are becoming a trans-global community of peers who have more in common with one another than with their countrymen back home. Whether they maintain primary residences in New York or Hong Kong, Moscow or Mumbai, today's super rich are increasingly a nation unto themselves. Close quote. I would add to that, the super rich of today clothe themselves in the protective legal fiction of corporate personhood. Now, Abraham Lincoln once said, quote, "I see in the near future a crisis approaching and unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. As a result of the war, corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands." The concept of a corporation as an entity, separate and apart from its owners, had its origin in ancient Rome, which gave birth to the idea of the personhood of a business organization. That is, that an organization can be considered an acceptable legal entity that can be vested by the government with many legal rights that previously had been granted only to individual humans. Thus, for the first time in human history, the identity of business organizations were not simply an extension of their owners, but an identity of a separate entity with a life, existence, rights, privileges, purposes, and goals apart from those of the individual. Recently, the United States Supreme Court, in the 2010 Citizens United case, resoundingly endorsed the idea that the corporation, for purposes of politics, is the same as people and has the same protections under the First Amendment. Now, corporations are increasingly recognized as persons with the same rights and constitutional protections as persons. What are their responsibilities as persons? Or should they be held to an even higher standard of responsibility than human persons? After all, as the concept of a corporation as a person has taken on extended life of its own, it has evolved into a sort of super personhood with attributes beyond that of a person, human person. For example, perpetual existence. And if we are creating corporate persons who potentially never die, are we in danger of creating a sort of super personhood that could further evolve into a Frankenstein, turning on its creators that they neglect to nurture and imbue it with ethical values? Corporations have a responsibility to the society that created them. Do corporations have a responsibility to think in terms of the interrelationship of a triple bottom line, people, planet? Milton Friedman framed the question in terms of the corporation's agents in the pursuit of corporate profits. Quoting Friedman, do corporate executives, provided they stay within the law, have responsibilities to their in their business activities other than to make as much money for their stockholders as possible? Well, his answer, as we're all familiar with, was, quote, no, they do not, close quote. David Langstaff, president and CEO of Task Incorporated, disagrees. Today's corporate purpose is being held hostage by the myth of shareholder primacy, and quotes UCLA professor Lynn Stout that chasing shareholder value is a managerial choice, not a legal requirement. Now, articles have been written calling for the redefinition of the purpose of the corporation around the concept of shared value, which involves creating economic value in a way that also creates value for society by addressing society's needs and challenges. Pope John Paul II used the term economism, considering human labor solely according to its economic purpose. We become obsessed with the concept of profit, per se. Former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich once said that management would view labor a lot differently if employees were seen as assets rather than expenses. Expenses, after all, profit. Unfortunately, the concept of profit gets glossed over in many of these discussions. It vastly oversimplifies the term to state that it is the difference between revenues and expenses. Friedman entitled his class's article, The Social Responsibility of Businesses to Increase Its Profit. And the term profit maximization has been a clarion call ever since. But as the furor over the heads of the auto industry flying into the nation's capital for a bailout of their financial difficulties show, the executives considered private jet travel a necessary and valid expense, even though by taking that expense rather than commercial travel, it arguably lessened corporate profits. So perhaps the question should be asked, are there valid social expenses that are the responsibility of the corporation, even though, like private jet travel for corporate executives, they also arguably lessen corporate profits? In a similar vein, why are excessive bonuses viewed as valid expenses, even though they lessen profits? While other stakeholder expenses are viewed as improper and seen as irresponsible, because from another perspective, they are only seen as lessening corporate profits for the shareholders. Two other authors, Porter and Kramer, developed the concept of shared value that recognizes that not all profits are equal and focuses companies on profits that create societal benefits rather than diminish them. They call for a more sophisticated form of capitalism, one imbued with social purpose. But that purpose should arise not out of charity, but out of a deeper understanding of competition and economic value creation. For as they state, it is not philanthropy, but self-interested behavior to create economic value by creating society. The interplay and development of individual responsibility in community runs through the works of Aristotle, Drucker, McIntyre, Solomon, and many others who have struggled with the concepts of social responsibility in business and business ethics. McIntyre was one of the first moral philosophers to propose a return to Aristotelian-based, value-based ethics because of its focus on excellence, virtue, community, personal character, individual, and external actions as a moral guide for action and decision. Earlier, after listening to Friedman's interview with Donahue, where Friedman scoffed Donahue for raising the issue of virtue in relation to capitalism, recall Friedman asking, where would we find these angels that will organize society for others? And I said, well, let me tell you. I'll tell you where. Look around. Go ahead. Look around. As E.B. White once wrote, as long as there is one upright man, as long as there is one compassionate woman, the contagion may spread and the scene is not lessened. The answer to Friedman's scoff lies in how we individually live our lives. And the answer lies in living in American University's mission statement. The power of one is frequently underestimated. Forbes magazine, just about everything that's today, allows blogs and readers to offer online content. I guess some people are Twitter tweeting. Anyhow, recently someone wrote a piece on the power of the individual in forums online, and how the internet provides the individual with influence and access to effecting change on a large scale. From time to time in class, I like to use the word "you" as an anagram. Now, not to be too cutesy, but Y stands for your, O for only, and U for uniqueness. As folks, each and every one of us is unique. Now, look around the room again. No two of us look alike, dress alike, always think alike. We are unique and have something to offer. Now, to further risk evolving into cutesiness, I'd like to recite for you a short poem called "The Power of One." It was written by a young techie living in Mumbai called Ashish Ram. He likes to write poetry and post on a site called Poem. He's a so-called amateur. His poem found its way to this presentation as I was searching the internet for something to illustrate the power of one. And this morning at the first session, I think it was just an overwhelming example to see all the sisters up there, to see the power of one. So here's Ashish Ram's poem, "The Power of One." One song can spark a moment. One whisper can wake a dream. One tree can start a forest. One bird can herald spring. One smile begins a friendship. One moment can make one fall in love. One star can guide a ship at sea. One word can frame the goal. One vote can change a nation. One sunbeam lights a room. One candle wipes out darkness. One laugh will conquer gloom. One step must start each journey. One word must start each prayer. One hope will raise our spirits. One touch can show you care. One voice can speak with wisdom. One heart can know what's true. One life can make a difference. You see, it's up to you. Back in 1967, when he was preparing to run for president of the United States, Bobby Kennedy wrote a book he entitled "To Seek a Newer World." The title was taken from Tennyson's poem, Ulysses, and Kennedy quoted a few lines of the poem on various occasions when he was trying to seek to lead us to a newer world during those difficult times. I've always been taken by a paragraph he wrote in the postscript, and I think it applies to what we've been talking about. Kennedy wrote, "If you fly in a plane over Europe, or Africa, or Asia, in a few hours you will cross over oceans and countries that have been a crucible of human history. In minutes you will trace the migration of men over thousands of years. Seconds, the briefest glimpse, and you will pass battlefields on which millions of men once struggled and died. You will see no national boundaries, no vast gulfs or high walls dividing people from people, only nature and the works of man. Homes, everywhere reflecting man's common effort to enrich his life. Everywhere, new technology and communication bring men and nations closer together. The concerns of one, more and more, becoming the concerns of all. And our new closeness is stripping away the false mask, the illusion of difference that is at the root of injustice and hate and war. Only earthbound man still clings to the dark and poisoning superstition that his world is bounded by the nearest hill, his universe ended at the river shore, his common humanity enclosed in the tight circle of those who share his town and beauty in the color of his skin. Today, I would add, only earthbound man still clings to the dark and poisoning superstition that his world is bounded by those who share the same social economic status, that share the same marvels of electricity and access to technology as shown in this slide. Pope Francis is trying to bring our attention to these disparities, trying to focus our attention on balancing the responsibilities of capitalism and the common good. In the conclusion of his book, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, Sandel writes, "Democracy does not require perfect equality, but it does require that citizens share in a common life. What matters is that people of different backgrounds and social positions encounter one another and bump up against one another in the course of everyday life. This is how we learn to negotiate and abide our differences, and how we come to care for the common good. Tennyson's poem Ulysses was the source of the title for Kennedy's book, Seek a Newer World. As a conclusion to this presentation, I would like to recite the final part of that poem. It certainly applies to me as I set sail toward retirement, as I set sail to complete the unfinished manuscript of my life. And in the spirit of Dominican University's mission statement, it urges us all to do what we can as individuals, imbued with the power of one, to go and seek a new world, to thirst for a more just and humane world. Tennyson wrote, "There lies the port. The vessel puffs her sail. There in gloom, the broad, dark sea. My mariners, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine and opposed. Free hearts, free foreheads, you and I are old. Anyway. Old age hath yet his honor and his toil. Death closes all, but something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with death. The light begins to twinkle from the rocks. The long day wanes, the moon slowly climbs, the deep moans round with many voices. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the bath of all the western stars, until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not the strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, not to yield. Thank you very much.
Professor Miller and Professor Calabrese, they each use up a full half hour, so you'll have to ask them questions in the hallway, or send them an email. Enjoy the rest of your day. Appreciate your efforts.